drifting in. We're going to be mostly in Judges 9 today with Abimelech, and we're going to be starting in Judges 8, verse 33. So you want to turn to Judges 8, verse 33. We'll start there. So chapter 8 was kind of Gideon's demise and poor ending. And we have in Judges 8, verse 33, so it was, as soon as Gideon was dead, that the children of Israel again played the harlot with the Baals, and made Baal-berith their god. Thus the children of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who had delivered them from the hands of all their enemies on every side. Nor did they show kindness to the house of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, in accordance with the good he had done for Israel. So not surprisingly, as we've seen with each of these narratives, we have this cycle of the Israelites sinning. They are oppressed as a judgment for God to bring them back to him. God raises up a deliverer, and then they fall back into sin once that deliverer is gone. And here, even though there was a peace for 40 years in the days of Gideon, once he's dead, immediately the Israelites fall back into sin. And in this case, it's kind of dialed up, because previously the refrain has been along the lines that Israel did evil, Israel forgot God. Now it's much stronger language that's used, and it's saying that they are playing the harlot, they are prostituting themselves with Baal and making Baal-berith their god. And not only that, we're going to see that Baal-berith, Baal means Lord, Berith means covenant. So this particular Baal is the Lord of the covenant. So they have exchanged the one true God and the covenants he's made with Israel for this false god of the Canaanites. Mike, if you could switch me over. Thank you. So in the overall structure of the book, Gideon is the central judge, where he starts good and ends poorly. And the entire structure of the book starts relatively positive with Othniel, Ehud, and Deborah, but ends not at all positively with Abimelech, Jephthah, and Samson. So this turning point of Gideon from beginning well to ending well is mirrored in the entire book of Judges, where it begins relatively positive and just continuously goes downhill. The account of Gideon is the last account of a judge, where it ends with the country was quiet for 40 years and had peace for 40 years. Gideon is the last judge that will see that. The rest of the narratives with Abimelech, Jephthah, and Samson, it goes right from deliverance back into sin with no hesitation, no pause, no peace. In the second half, and if we have time today, we'll show some parallels between the account between Abimelech and the account of Deborah and Barak. Because the way that the book is structured, the second half, the narrative of Abimelech, has some parallels both in similarities and contrast to Deborah and Barak. Jephthah, the next narrative, has some contrasts and similarities back to Ehud. Samson back to Othniel, and then the epilogue or conclusion back to the introduction and beginning. So if we have time today, we'll look at that. If we don't, we'll look at that next time. We may or may not get through Abimelech today. Abimelech may end up being 2 weeks, as it is a fairly long chapter for Abimelech. Though some of it I'm going to go through fairly quickly without a lot of comments. But before we get into that further, we should open with prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day that we could come together, look at your word, and see what you have for us today. Pray for those down the hall who are working with the kids and the teens, that they would have a good family Bible hour, and that as we then move later into the morning service, that you'd be with Pastor as he brings the message, and as we worship together. In Jesus' name, amen. So a lot of chapter 9 centers around the city of Shechem and the people of Shechem. And so before we get into chapter 9, we're going to talk a little bit of background and context of the city of Shechem, where it is, why it's significant. And if you didn't get the handout for today, there's a handout in the back. With that, it has a section. I'm not going to go through all the references. I'm just going to kind of mention them. But if you want to know more about Shechem, Shechem appears a lot in the Bible. So I put together a list of some, not all, but some of the references to Shechem. And we're going to talk about some of those here. So first off, for our map of Israel, we have the raisin, the rope, and the peanut, better known as the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, and the Dead Sea. And so use that as your kind of orientation to the geography of Israel. And then we have the coastline. Jerusalem would be about there, west of the northern end of the Dead Sea in the mountains. Shechem is about 30 miles north of Jerusalem and is south of Ophrah, which was Gideon's hometown. Shechem is in a mountain pass between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. And so because it's this valley in this mountain pass, it has very good water supplies, very fertile land, there are major trade routes that go through there. So Shechem, like Megiddo, was on a trade route in a mountain pass that allowed trade from the east of the Jordan River and also then from the south from Jerusalem. So because of that, it was strategically located. It was an important city. It was also a fairly wealthy city, partially because they had really good water supplies, which is important in a desert country. They had strategic location for trade. The first mention of Shechem in the Bible is in Genesis 12, where Abram is moving from Haran to the Promised Land. Shechem is the first city that Abram comes to when he enters into the Promised Land, following God's command that he leave his land Haran and go to this new land. It's also in Shechem where God promises to Abraham's descendants that he will give this land. And when God makes that promise, Abraham builds an altar there to God and sacrifices to God there. So Shechem, right off the bat, when God is making promises to Abraham that he is going to build up this nation of Israel, Shechem is one of the locations where that promise is made. And then Abraham moves on to Bethel. In Genesis 33, Jacob, as he's returning from North Mesopotamia, having kind of fled from Esau, he travels to Shechem. He buys land in Shechem and builds an altar to God in Shechem. In Genesis 34, there's a really kind of evil and disturbing account of Shechem, who is the son of Hamor. And Shechem is either named after the city of Shechem, or the city of Shechem is named for him, as Hamor is the individual who founded the city of Shechem. And he has his son named Shechem. We don't know whether Shechem was named after the city or the city was named after his son. But very clearly an influential family. He defiles one of Jacob's daughters, who Leah, Dinah. His sexual relationships with her. He then wants to marry her. Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, are having none of this, and rightly so. So this is, in this account, it's kind of a disturbing account where they go to Shechem. They confront Hamor in Shechem. Shechem indicates his interest in marrying Dinah, and they're like, oh, well, you know what? You're uncircumcised, you can't marry him. If you and all the men get circumcised, we'll consider this. But this is just a ruse. When Shechem agrees to this, before they are recovered from the circumcision, Simeon, Levi, and their men kill Hamor, Shechem, and the other men. This, of course, kind of leads to tensions between the family of Jacob and Shechem. So Jacob then finds that it would be best if his family relocate away from Shechem at this point. One of the notable things as he relocates, so in Genesis 35, is that as he's leaving, he takes all of his family idols and earrings and buries them and abandons them. So one of the good things that came out of this is evidently at that point, Jacob was starting to absorb some of the culture of Shechem in terms of false gods. And he abandons those and goes to Bethel. Though he evidently retained land in the area, because the next reference is in Genesis 37, where Jacob sends Joseph to find his brothers who are tending sheep near Shechem. And this is after Joseph had upset his brothers with his dream that they were going to bow down to him. And Jacob hadn't helped this with his favoritism to Joseph. So as Joseph is looking for his brothers in Shechem, they've moved on to Dothan, fairly close to there, and are now conspiring to kill Joseph. Instead, they decided it would be more profitable to, rather than killing their brother, to selling him into slavery. So far, some references to Shechem here. Some important things are, one, it's where God made a covenant with Abraham that he would give them the land. But it's also where there's been some conflict between Jacob and his sons and the people of Shechem, and also conflict between Jacob's sons in terms of the conflict between Joseph and his older brothers. So the next appearance of Shechem is in Joshua 8. And Shechem isn't specifically mentioned here, but Joshua gathers the people to Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, and about half of the tribes are at the foot of Mount Ebal, and the other half are at the foot of Mount Gerizim, facing across the valley, which would be Shechem. So even though Shechem isn't mentioned there, Shechem is the city that they are at. And it's not that he's gathering them to attack Shechem here. He's gathering them to remind them and read them Moses' words, God's covenant. So we have another time where Shechem here is a spot where God's people come and are reminded of his covenant, like Abraham was, and reminded of his promises, and reminded of the curses that will come if they are unfaithful to God. In Joshua 20, Shechem is chosen as a city of refuge. In Joshua 21, Shechem is given to the Levites as common land, because the Levites did not have a military presence, as their duties were to the tabernacle, to the temple. At that time, it would have been the tabernacle. As the priests, as the religious leaders, basically, of the day. And so Shechem is given to the Levites. And it's also a city of refuge, in that if somebody in a work accident ended up killing somebody, they could flee to a city of refuge, and there they could wait for then the Levites to judge whether they were innocent or whether they were guilty. Whether it was an accidental death and they should be ruled innocent and not be stoned, or whether it was murder and they should be. So Shechem was also a city of refuge. Joshua 24, Joshua gathers all the Israelites again to Shechem before his death and reminds them of God's covenant, God's promises, and the curses that would come on them if they were not true to God. And here, before Joshua's death, all of Israel promises to serve God. They promise not to follow the false gods of Canaan. And Joshua sets up a stone under the tree in Shechem as a witness of this promise. So we have Abraham's built an altar there. Jacob's built an altar there. Both Abraham and Jacob purchased land in Shechem. God has promised Abraham the land there. Joshua has brought the people there not once but twice to remind them of God's covenant, remind them of their place as being God's people. Now, something that's kind of interesting in there is nowhere in the book of Joshua is Shechem listed as a city that the Israelites took in battle. Archaeologically, the city of Shechem has been found. It was discovered in 1903 and has been extensively investigated and dug from an archaeological standpoint since then. Recently, the archaeological digs there have had a damper put on them because of terrorist activity in the area. But Shechem, during the age of Joshua, there is no indication that the city was attacked in any way. There's no indication there were any battles in Shechem during Joshua's time period. And that's consistent with the Bible not mentioning that the Israelites had a battle there. They likely didn't. There is evidence that prior to the Israelites coming from Egypt into the Promised Land, that Shechem was attacked by the Egyptians and destroyed and then was rebuilt. And during the time when Joshua would have been leading the people in Israel was kind of this golden age of Shechem where there was no indication of conflict. In fact, complete opposite as far as prosperity and peace. The Bible doesn't specifically mention how Shechem became Israelite. But there are some clues in that it's unlikely that Joshua would have brought the people not once, but twice to Shechem if Shechem had been a Canaanite stronghold. That would be a strange place to bring the people together because that would probably end in a battle rather than in worship to God. There are some scholars who do think that Shechem was Canaanite and that Shechem was not taken by the Israelites. But again, that doesn't fit with Joshua bringing the people to Shechem, and especially in Joshua 8, where half of them are on the Mount Ebal side, half of them on the Mount Gerizim side. If the city in the middle is Canaanite and is hostile to the Israelites, this is not going to end peacefully. But there's no indication in the Bible that there was a battle there. There was no indication archaeologically that there was a battle there. But there is some archaeological evidence from the Amarna letters. Now, the Amarna letters are archaeological find that are these communications between Canaanite kings and Egypt. Even though the Canaanite kings were these semi-autonomous city-states that they ruled over and had independence, they did have a loose allegiance to Egypt. And so because of that, there's these letters back and forth between the kings and the pharaohs in Egypt that there's quite a bit of archaeological evidence for, which is very much consistent with the biblical account. And in the time of Joshua, well, there is these letters between King Lebuah, who was at that time the king of Shechem, and the Egyptian Pharaoh Amenhotep III. And Lebuah is actually defending himself against accusations of treason and rebellion for his inaction against an invading people, referred to in the Amarna letters as the Hebrew, H-A-B-I-R-U. Now, archaeological scholars, biblical scholars, do not know definitively that the Hebrew are the Hebrew people. But it lines up that most think that that was what the Canaanites and Egyptians were calling the Hebrews, the Israelites. The Hebrew, H-A-B-I-R-U, but that would have been in Egyptian, not English. And so very likely here, Lebuah is defending himself against accusations of treason and rebellion because he did not take action against Joshua and the Israelites when they came in. Not only that, there's another letter where Abdi-Heba, who is the ruler of Jerusalem at that time, writes to the Pharaoh demanding that the Pharaoh send him men as a defensive measure to protect Jerusalem and all the lands in the town of Canaan that are falling to the Hebrew. And he says in this letter, are we to act like Laban when he was giving the land of Shechem to the Hebrew? So very likely the reason there's no sign of battles there is that when Joshua came through, the king of Shechem made peace with Israel and pretty much handed Shechem over to Israel. And so Israel was able to take over Shechem without battle, most likely. Laban himself is not mentioned in the Bible, and that's understandable because in this time where he was defending himself, he traveled to Egypt, and he mysteriously died on his way to Egypt. Whether there was a hit from the Pharaoh, or whether it was God's intervention, or whether it was just a coincidence, we don't know, but his reign at Shechem ended mysteriously in that while he was traveling to Egypt to defend himself to the Pharaoh, he was mysteriously killed. And at that time, we have the Israelite presence around Shechem, an absence of king. And so it makes sense that at that time, Shechem just peacefully became under control of Joshua and the Israelites. And because this is a sacred place, because of Abraham's presence there, etc., that it became this focal point that Joshua brought the people to remind them of their covenant with God. It's also where Jacob is buried. It's also where Joseph is buried. Why all that time in Shechem? Well, this passage starts with, so it was soon as Gideon was dead that the children of Israel again played the harlot with the Baals and made Baal-berith their god. And that would be in Judges chapter 8, verse 33, as we're transitioning from Gideon to Abimelech. Baal-berith, name translates to Lord of the Covenant. Here, this place of Shechem should have had so much meaning to the Israelites as a place of covenant with Jehovah, the one true God. And here at Gideon's death, they have turned away from that completely and are now making a new covenant with Baal. Israel is at a really bad point here. It's going to get worse as we go through the book of Judges, but this is the lowest point so far, where they have forgotten the God who used Gideon to deliver them from the Midianites already. They have forgotten and they have accepted Baal-berith. Not only that, a little bit additional archaeological digs in Shechem have found the temple of Baal-berith, and it is the largest temple to Baal that has so far been found in the land of Canaan. The footprint was 70 foot by 86 foot and was a multi-storied temple tower. It was a very, very large temple, and this was where Israel had turned their attention to. One of the commentaries that I've read, the author of that, Kenneth Way, mentions God's people put themselves in grave danger when they become functionally like the world around them. And that is exactly what Israel did here. They turned their back on God and turned to a different covenant. So let's take a look. So that's the sin. And the sin here has gotten worse. So in our cycle of sin, oppression, and deliverance, the sin here is turning their back on God, and not only that, turning their back on God at this place that should have had very strong historical sacred reminder with multiple altars and this stone of witness that Joshua set up. It's very likely that that stone of witness was still there, because we're going to see a stone that was probably that stone show up in a couple verses here. So, in chapter 9, verse 1, then Abimelech, the son of Jerubbaal, who is Gideon, went to Shechem to his mother's brothers and spoke with them and with all the family of the house of his mother's father, saying, please speak in the hearing of all the men of Shechem. Which is better for you, that all 70 of the sons of Jerubbaal reign over you, or that one reign over you? Remember that I am your own flesh and bone. So Gideon has died. Abimelech sees his opportunity, goes to Shechem. His mother was a concubine that Gideon had from Shechem. So he has family ties in his mother's sides to Shechem. He goes to them. He points out that he has 70 brothers who are sons of Gideon. Would it be better to follow them or to follow him, their relative? So he's politicking. And so his mother's brothers, in verse 3, spoke all these words concerning him in the hearing of all the men of Shechem, and their heart was inclined to follow Abimelech. For they said, he is our brother. So they gave him 70 shekels of silver from the temple of Baal-berith, which with Abimelech hired worthless and reckless men, and they followed him. So Shechem is bought into this. They're like, yep, we will monetarily support your play to become the leader here as Gideon has died. And so he is funded with money from the temple of Baal. And he uses that money to hire mercenaries who in the New King James are described as worthless and reckless men. The NIV describes them, the translation of the NIV, as reckless adventurers. You know, I kind of picture in today's terms, there is a group of people kicking back Red Bulls and making YouTube videos of their exploits in the desert. And here, Abimelech comes along and hands him some money and says, I've got a job for you. We have a job to do. And so the job is, then he went to his father's house at Ophrah. So they travel from Shechem north to Ophrah. And they kill his brothers, the 70 sons of Jerubbaal, on one stone. But Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, was left because he hid himself. So he takes these mercenaries, and his first act here with this money that he's gotten is to go and kill, or try to kill, all of his brothers. We've seen in the cycle of Judges, with each narrative, there's sin, and then oppression, and then deliverance. The previous accounts and narratives, the oppression has always been God pulling in the case of Othniel is pulling in the Mitanni to oppress. In Ehud, it was the Moabites. With Barak and Deborah, it was the Canaanites led by King Jabin. In the Gideon narrative, it was the Midianites. Here, God doesn't need, sadly, to send an oppressor. The oppressor is already part of Israel. This isn't an external oppression. Abimelech, the son of Gideon, the previous judge, is the one leading the oppression. Here it has gotten so bad that Israel's sin, God does not even have to raise up an oppressor to judge them. They are about to make the oppressor their king. After he kills 69 of Gideon's other sons, because Gideon's youngest son, Jotham, is able to hide himself. So verse 6, and all of the men of Shechem gathered together, all of Beth Milo, and they went and made Abimelech king beside the terebinth tree at the pillar that was in Shechem. The terebinth tree here is likely the same tree that's mentioned where Abraham built his altar to God. The terebinth tree is likely the same tree that Jacob turned his back on the idols and buried them. The pillar here is likely the stone of witness that Joshua set up to remind the Israelites that they had promised they would be true to Jehovah God and that they would not follow Baal-berith. And this is where, as they are now following Baal-berith, the men of Shechem, acting on the part of Israel, chooses Abimelech as this completely illegitimate king as their leader. And it's not just that he's becoming the king of Shechem. Let's see. I'm going to skip ahead and then come back. In Joshua 9, verse 22, so Judges 9, verse 22, sorry about that. Judges 9, verse 22, it says, after Abimelech had reigned over Israel 3 years. So here it's an indication that Abimelech becoming king of Shechem, he was not just becoming king of Shechem as the city, he was becoming king of at least the northern tribes of Israel, at least of Manasseh and Ephraim. And Manasseh and Ephraim, they're the tribes that are associated with Joseph. Joseph is buried in Shechem. Talk about doing evil on somebody's grave. They are picking Abimelech as this illegitimate king on Joseph's grave, essentially. Not only that, it's also kind of a reminder here, except for dialed up to 10, of what Joseph's brothers did to him. They conspired near Shechem to kill Joseph, and instead they sold him into slavery. Here, Abimelech kills 70 or 69 of his brothers. He's dialed up the sin from previous generations. He's also dialed up the sin from what Gideon had been doing. We're going to see that Abimelech kind of takes on some of the bad that Gideon had adopted in the second part of his life, in the vengeance that Gideon took against Succoth and Peniel. Abimelech takes that and just dials it up even worse. So we have this generational sin getting worse here. Now we saw earlier in Judges 2, I'm not going to turn there, but a theme that each generation has a responsibility to teach the next. And we saw Othniel was a good example of that, where Caleb had taught him to be godly, and Othniel and his wife Achsah were very godly. We saw that with Ehud, where Ehud had been taught and trained by his parents and prepared by his parents. Where here we see a breakdown of that. Very clearly, Gideon either did not teach Abimelech well, or Abimelech didn't follow well. Because we saw earlier, one of the themes was each generation has a responsibility to teach the next, and the next generation has the responsibility to know and apply what they've been taught, and then teach it to the next generation. Very clearly here, Abimelech's actions of going to Shechem, getting paid money from the temple of Baal, and killing his brothers is not the legacy that Gideon would have wanted. I don't think anybody wants this legacy for their kids. But that's the legacy. This is Gideon's legacy here, unfortunately. Now, we don't know whether it's because Abimelech was taught well and went wrong, or he wasn't taught well, because it doesn't specifically say that in the Bible. But I think we definitely have some clues in terms of how Gideon acted when we talked about last week, how he started to act out of vengeance. Not only that, the fact he had 70 sons meant he had a lot of wives and a concubine, at least one concubine, possibly more. Even if he was saying the right words to Abimelech, like he did when the Israelites came to Gideon and said, "You should be our king," and he said, no, God is your king. He said the right words, but then his next action after that was to take tribute from the Israelites, and to take that tribute and make it into a golden ephod that became a center of worship in Ophrah, that even though it wasn't an idol to Baal, it was a graven image that was contrary to the Ten Commandments. It was contrary to how God should be worshipped. And that was a snare that helped to lead Israel to where they are right now in terms of turning to Baal Bereth, partially because of Gideon's actions. So even if Gideon was saying the right words to Abimelech, very clearly his actions were sending a very bad message to Abimelech in terms of how he dealt with Succoth and Peniel, how he dealt with a call to leadership, how he dealt with women. He's not specifically condemned for having multiple wives, and there are many individuals who had multiple wives in the Old Testament, and not always are they called out for that. But every single time man has multiple wives in the Old Testament, the legacy is not good. The legacy is bad. And so very clearly, even if it's not stated, this is not what God wanted for a marital relationship. It becomes very clear in the aftermath. Here, the aftermath is Abimelech is killing all his brothers and being set up as king under the terebinth tree with money from Baal-berith. So the oppression here is internal, and Israel has chosen their own oppressor. They've called Abimelech to be their king, and in doing so, they have called him to oppress them, basically. Now, Jotham is the voice of wisdom here, and one of the kind of parallels between the account of Deborah and Barak and of Abimelech is that both of them have a narrative and some poetry. In the case of Deborah and Barak, it's a narrative about the battle and then a poem that is praising God. Here, it's a parable that Jotham, the youngest son of Gideon, who survived, proclaims, and in this case, not as a praise of God, but as a warning of the justice that God is going to bring on Abimelech, Shechem, and Israel for their evilness. I should switch over. There we go. If you didn't get the handout, it has this on it as far as kind of an overview of Abimelech. And like I said, we're not going to make it through all of Abimelech today. We'll probably do the parable and then pick up after the parable, or the parable or the fable. So Judges 9, verse 7. Now when they told Jotham, he went and stood on top of Mount Gerizim. So he's gone into hiding. He's now been told that not only did Abimelech just kill all his brothers, Abimelech has now been crowned king. And lifted his voice and cried out and said to them, "Listen to me, you men of Shechem, that God may listen to you. The trees once went forth to anoint a king over them, and they said to the olive tree, 'Reign over us.' But the olive tree said to them, 'Should I cease giving my oil, with which they honor God and men, and go to sway over trees?' Then the trees said to the fig tree, 'You come and reign over us.' But the fig tree said to them, 'Should I cease my sweetness and my good fruit and go to sway over trees?' And then the trees said to the vine, 'You come and reign over us.' But the vine said to them, 'Should I cease my new wine, which cheers both God and men, and go to sway over trees?' Then all the trees said to the bramble, they said to the thorn bush, 'You come and reign over us.' And the bramble said to the trees, 'If in truth you anoint me as king over you, then come and take shelter in my shade. But if not, let fire come out of the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon.' Now therefore, if you have acted in truth and in sincerity in making Abimelech king, and if you have dealt well with Jerubbaal and his house, and have done to him as he deserves, for my father fought for you, risked his life, and delivered you out of the hand of Midian. But you have risen up against my father's house this day, and killed his 70 sons on one stone, and made Abimelech, the son of his female servant, king over the men of Shechem, because he is your brother. If then you have acted in truth and sincerity with Jerubbaal and with his house this day, then rejoice in Abimelech, and let him rejoice in you. But if not, let fire come from Abimelech and devour the men of Shechem and Beth Milo. And let fire come from the men of Shechem and from Beth Milo and devour Abimelech.' And Jotham ran away and fled, and he went to Beer and dwelt there for fear of Abimelech his brother." And not only Abimelech his brother, but all the people who are following Abimelech. He's not just running from Abimelech, he's running from Shechem, the house of Beth Milo, and presumably, since we know from verse 22 that Abimelech is not just ruling over Shechem, but over at least northern Israel, of the people that his father Gideon helped to deliver from the Midianites. So with this, there's this fable where trees are used symbolically here, and the tree is looking for a king and a leader. and they go to 3 worthwhile good trees: the olive tree, the fig tree, and the vine. Or I should say plants, since the vine isn't really a tree. And all of them come up with excuses on why they cannot be the leaders. And so, not finding good leaderships from the worthwhile leaderships, they continue looking, and they go to the bramble, the thorn bush, and the bramble and the thorn bush is like, yeah, I'm on board, I'll be your leader. You can find shade under me. How good of a shade does bramble and thorn bushes provide? There's a little bit of irony here. The thorn bush, the bramble, is completely worthless. And that we've already seen mentioned once in this passage. That was exactly the people that Abimelech hired to be his hitmen, basically, his mercenaries, these reckless and worthless people. So obviously, this is Jotham going to Shechem in Israel and saying, you have picked poorly with picking Abimelech. And you have done wrong to Gideon's legacy by doing this. Now, for the most part, Jotham is correct here, though Jotham does make a small mistake. He does point out, he says, his father fought for you, risked his life, and delivered you out of the hand of Midian. Jotham's even forgotten it wasn't Gideon, it was God using Gideon. Jotham's even forgotten that already. Though he does recognize that God is going to bring judgment on Abimelech and Shechem, and he's going to bring judgment not by an outside oppressor, but having Abimelech and Shechem destroy each other. And we'll see next week that comes true. But I want to end here with pointing out 3 things about leadership that are in this parable. We've seen so far in the book of Judges quite a bit about leadership, and often about a lack of leadership, often about hesitant leadership. So with the account of Deborah and Barak, we saw that Barak was very hesitant, and Deborah had to call him and remind him that God had sent him, and Barak's like, I'm scared, I'll only go if you go with me. And Deborah does. We see with Gideon even a higher level of hesitancy in leadership, in that multiple times God sends messages to him, an angel to him, God talks to him directly and tells him, God is telling Gideon that he is going to be the one who delivers Israel from the Midianites. And Gideon is so hesitant, he tests God with the fleeces, and finally then when he gets on board and God delivers with the 300, to make it very clear that God was the one delivering the Israelites out of the hand of the Midianites, Gideon even kind of forgets that in the second half of his narrative and starts to kind of think that he's the one who delivered them. And clearly his son Jotham thinks that. So some things on leadership here. First, this poem indicts Abimelech as this false, illegitimate king. But it additionally also indicts those who are fit for leadership, who are either hesitant or reject the call of leadership. So even though the thorn bush is the only one who said yes, the olive tree, the fig tree, and the vine all said no, and came up with reasons why they couldn't do it, because their oil was more important, their sweetness was more important, etc. Well, who says them being a king means they had to stop being an olive tree, stop being a fig tree? Just because an individual called to be a leader doesn't mean they have to stop doing the good that they're doing. The bramble and thorn bush certainly didn't stop doing the evil that they were good at doing when they accepted the call of leadership. So the flip is also true. So this is also an indictment that God is making here against those in Israel who kind of set up Abimelech being king because they were fit for leadership, they were possibly called by God for leadership, and they rejected the responsibility. We saw that kind of with Barak, but he came around. We saw that with Gideon, he sort of came around and then went rogue. So first, we have this indictment against Abimelech, the worthless thorn bush leader. But we also see an indictment against those who are fit for leadership, who God called to leadership, who didn't accept. There's also kind of an indictment here against those who are so desperate for leadership that they will accept the thorn bush as their leader. Just because the fig tree and the olive tree and the vine in this parable or fable said no, that doesn't mean that they should have then picked the worthless leader, the thorn bush. And we see that in modern times. We're desperate for leadership. It's like, well, this person's not really that great, but you know what? We'll take them anyways. And that never ends well, whether it's politically, whether it's within a church setting, whether it is in families, whether it is in a workplace. And so even though it's important that individuals step up for leadership, very clear from this, there are some who are fit for leadership and should accept that. There are some, like Abimelech, who are not fit for leadership. And unfortunately here, things are turned upside down, where those who are fit for leadership, like Barak and Gideon were, are the hesitant ones. And Abimelech, who is not fit for leadership, he doesn't even wait to be called. He goes to Shechem, gets him to pay him to kill off the competition, and then they're like, yeah, this is a great leader. And he's not. He's a worthless leader. So we have to be careful with leadership in terms of both calling those who are fit to be leaders and not being so desperate that we turn to people who aren't fit for leadership to be our leaders. And at the same time, though, individuals who are fit for leadership and God has called them for leadership need to respond to that. And we see that as far as here, kind of a warning in the first part of Abimelech. We'll continue on with Abimelech next time, which will be, let's see, we'll be starting in chapter 9, verse 17, and then going to the end of chapter 9, hopefully. And so we've looked at today kind of the rise of Abimelech as the oppressor here. Next, we're going to see the fall of Abimelech and God's justice against the evil that Abimelech has brought. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this word that you've given us. Pray that we'll apply it to our lives and become better for it. Pray for the morning service that would worship you in song. We'll worship you in listening to your word and a reading of your word. And pray for Pastor as he brings your word to us, that we might learn from it and grow. And in Jesus' name.